For 150 years, various governments and politicians have been doing everything they can to vilify immigrants, which is why today we're looking at immigration on the public gallery. Immigration has always been a key part of how this country works. It's part of the fabric of Aotearoa, right from the moment the first waka arrived, all the way through until March 2023, which saw our largest ever number of net migrant growth. But along the way, there have been some, really racist stumbling blocks. In the 1870s, for example, a poll tax was introduced that very specifically targeted Asian migrants that stopped them from being able to become naturalized citizens. And that was in place until 1944, which is a hell of a long time, to be fair, to have that kind of law in place. There are some big events that have changed how our migration patterns work and what our laws work. Like World War II, we loosened the ability for Jewish migrants to be able to come into the country as they relocated after the war in Europe. But our policies have, for a very long time, been very Eurocentric. In the 1860s and 70s, agents were sent from the New Zealand government over to the United Kingdom to talk people into supplanting their culture into the South Island here. It's part of the reason why Otago is so Scottish and Canterbury is so English, while at the same time we were telling Asian people that they can't be here and we don't want them to become citizens. In 1953, the Department of External Affairs actually released a memorandum that said, and I quote, "Our immigration is based firmly on the principle that we are and intend to remain a country of European development. It is inevitably discriminatory against Asians, indeed against all persons who are not wholly of European race and colour. Whereas we have done much to encourage immigration from Europe, we do everything to discourage it from Asia." End quote. That as a policy is really daunting and not something that you would expect to see these days. But that type of racist baiting against immigration is exactly what got Winston Peters into Parliament in the early 2000s and made it slightly awkward for him to work out a free trade deal with China at the same time as our Foreign Affairs Minister. In the 1970s, we saw laws relax around Pacific Islanders being able to come into the country, and then in the mid-1970s, dawn raids started which unfairly targeted Pacific Island communities. In fact, the vast majority of dawn raids on those communities were really bad for both the community and for the country, and the vast majority of overstayers at the time were actually European and North American. Very specifically targeting communities of colour it's racist. We're still seeing dawn raids to this day, which is a real problem. In the mid-80s, the laws changed, so it wasn't based on what part of the world you came from, but what sort of skill set you were able to bring. It included things like making sure that you've got a job offer when you come over to the country, and it was based more on a points system. In the early 2000s, the laws changed again to allow the government to bring in people who had money. You essentially had an investment option as part of the immigration process, and you could buy your way into the country if you had enough money. Our laws are constantly evolving and constantly changing, and we're seeing that again now post-COVID, because like everyone else in the world, we have skills shortages that aren't being met by people in this country. It takes too long to train people up, we don't have people sticking around because of a whole bunch of factors, and we've got a need for doctors, nurses, bus drivers, people to pick fruit. Our immigration laws are constantly evolving, but it doesn't change the fact that this country was kind of built on, a promise of racism. And a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of racist media backlash, individuals out there promoting racism, a lot of that comes down to the fact that when these people move to the country, or their parents move to this country, or their grandparents move to the country, they were promised a white country, and they're not particularly able to adjust to that. It's really a fascinating look at history. Now, the first question I asked our panel today, and we're talking to Scout, Sam, and Art this week, was whether or not they actually had any experience with immigration, them or direct family members. Let's jump in and see what they had to say.
No. Generally speaking, all of us were at least born here. I have a grandmother who immigrated here from England way back before my mum was born. But other than that, everyone was born here.
No, not that I'm aware of. Um, my uncle's wife is a migrant from South Korea, and her two children are also South Korean. So my cousins are Korean.
Under the John Key national government, there were changes made to our immigration laws as well that didn't focus specifically on the skills that somebody brought in, but on the amount of money that they had. The idea of a financial investor visa was a really big part of their policy plans around immigration, and their thought process was if these people have money and are here, they'll invest it here. Whether or not that actually succeeded is debatable. What was clear, though, is that this was not the most popular choice when you're calling out for people in highly skilled areas like doctors, teachers, police, not being able to get in at the expense of somebody who basically bought their way into the country. There were some real headaches like that, but that's not the only example we've got of issues around immigration that our panel see. I asked them really specifically if there were any examples of sort of migratory groups that were causing issues, whether or not business investors were the ones that are the problem, or whether or not it was getting over unskilled labor to do unskilled work when we have a workforce that could do that here. What kind of migration groups were going to be the ones that caused the biggest headaches?
I mean, this is critical because, like, we have people that we could employ here in New Zealand. We have individuals that could learn from our own institutions. Um, and I mean, as much as we could bring in refugees, and resettle them here in this country, what sort of jobs can they be qualified to be? What can they work in? Whereas if we teach our own young individuals, grow them up to be strong and smart and kind of professional in certain sectors, I think we would progress more as a country. Because New Zealand has a program that's aimed at providing humanitarian assistance to refugees. That's about it. I mean, that's just the most critical part I could mention here.
My biggest problem would be not refugees, but well off people who come here and attempt to change our country to what either they expect New Zealand to be or to a mini version of their country. A prime example of this would be Rudy Deploy. He was well off before he came here because of apartheid. And then he comes here and he's running for the New Conservatives. He is a perennial candidate. If there's an election in Hamilton West, he's running. So yeah, I don't feel like someone like a refugee or someone who's come here to pick fruit is going to change New Zealand, but someone with a bit of money behind them, money in politics is what it is. So like, I'm less worried that a refugee is going to come here and drive a cab than I am that someone who, grew up in apartheid and benefited from it will come here and want to change our political system. Rudy Deploy brought at my dad's church, Central Baptist. He had a lecture on the Day of the Vow, which is essentially an Afrikaans celebration of killing a lot of brown people. And God helped them do it. Never mind the muskets versus spears. God made that victory happen. And then he runs for parliament and he runs for these political parties that, while not apartheid, pretty much apartheid. Like the guy who's doing his little tour at the moment, Bachelor, yeah, like he's kind of calling for a system of us and them, and it's see that kind of see, even though he's a New Zealander, but that kind of stuff we don't bloody well need. We already had the Springbok riots 40 years ago. We don't need to do it again just because Rudy Deploy is now the Prime Minister.
The idea of a culturally assimilated migrant is really prevalent across most Western societies. And when that assimilation doesn't go 100% to plan, it can cause issues. It might be something that doesn't seem overly big, like complaining about their Indian neighbor who's making a curry. Doesn't seem like a big thing, but that's a very important part of their culture. It's what they know, it's delicious, but it can cause some people to get really angry and upset. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody like Rudy Duploy, who very specifically set up a ceremony to celebrate the Day of the Vow, a South African holiday that's now defunct because apartheid ended, that was set up to celebrate a massacre of Zulu warriors by colonial invaders. You can sort of see how one is a lot worse than the other. Hopefully? But there's one thing about cultural assimilation that we do really all need to understand. It's if people move to a country, they want to be there. They'll have their reasons for it, and there'll be some adaptation that goes on for them, but they want to be there. The group that Scout mentioned when I asked them this question doesn't want that at all, because they're the 501s.
I know that we do have issues when, for instance, there's some forced immigration going on with New Zealand citizens who um, spent their entire lives in Australia and then were deported for, after serving entire prison sentences, were deported for their crimes back to New Zealand. The 501 deportees, prison doesn't really set you up. We've talked about this. It doesn't really set you up for success. And to then be immediately deported into a place where you don't know anybody, you don't necessarily know your whānau here, you don't have connections here, that can be really hard. So other than that process, I'm not particularly opposed to immigration.
If you listen to the media and politicians, especially right now, you'll hear 501s as being one of the leading causes for the increase in crime and the amount of gang violence going on in the country. They're directly to blame for the importing of 2 gangs that came here from Australia through this process. And that information isn't necessarily wrong, but it is kind of misleading. Not everybody who gets deported under the 501s has committed a crime. Just hanging out with people who might be deported is enough for that 501 process to begin. Some of these people have absolutely no family ties whatsoever to the country. They have to rely on extended family when they get here. And if they've got connections already in a gang environment, that feels like extended family to them. The other issue that crops up is it's a really inhumane process from the Australian end. The High Commissioner on Human Rights in Australia actually described the process, the detainment centres that New Zealanders are put in before they're sent over here, as being a breach on the standards for human rights from the United Nations for torture. That's right, actual torture. Kiwis being tortured before they get sent home. The rates of self-harm and suicide in those areas is absolutely massive. And there are some truly horrific stories which I am not going to repeat here. But it is not an easy process. It's a torturous process to send people that have never grown up in this country back here to assimilate. Both Andrew Costa, the person in charge of the police, as well as the leader of the opposition and most of our major media outlets, have put the blame for a rise in aggravated crime firmly on the arrival of 501s. There are claims that since this started in 2015 that they have been responsible for 10,000 violent crimes. Since 2015, police statistics show us 2.3 million violent crimes have been committed in this country, and they're responsible for 10,000 of them. Which doesn't seem statistically as high as you might think. But being forced into a culture, into a country that you had no choice to and have very indirect links to these days, that's tough for everybody. The other group, though, of migrants that kind of have the same issues of going to a country where they might not necessarily feel like they connect with the culture in some way, is refugees. But the difference is a refugee is fleeing somewhere which is unsafe for them. They're moving somewhere that's welcoming them and want them here. Every year, Aotearoa takes in about 1,500 refugees from around the world, and there's a couple of different ways that that can happen. It could be somebody who's already living here, who can't go back to where they were coming from, and it's as simple as them going up to somebody like a WINS officer or a police officer saying, I would like to be a refugee, and the process starts for them. From outside the country who are looking for refugee status, they go through a United Nations process, and they basically pick which country they want to go to, and it's a bit of a complicated mission to get them here. Once refugees are brought into the country, they go through a re-establishment program in Mangere, where they're taught a little bit about New Zealand culture, what it means to be here, and for some of them, English is a second language course, because for a lot of refugees, English learning is not their top priority, but they definitely need it to be able to communicate. From there, they're then sent out to other parts of the country where they are helped by the Red Cross to assimilate into our culture. When it comes to refugees, though, this is also oddly a really contentious issue. For a very long time, our refugee total was only 600 people a year. That got increased when Labour got into Parliament in 2017. But whether or not it's a good idea to bring refugees in well, I think that depends on who you ask. Scout has some really interesting experience, though, as somebody who worked with the Red Cross to help re establish refugees in this country, particularly in the South Island, which had issues being able to assimilate people into culture because of the earthquakes.
I was one of the volunteers working with the first refugee intake to Aotearoa. So our first refugee intake to Dunedin was in 2016, and I was one of the volunteers on that intake. It was a case of having infrastructure and support to make sure that people coming in were going to be adequately supported. So it was obviously not too long after the Christchurch earthquakes. The intakes to Christchurch had been suspended because of the earthquakes. While they were in that rebuild phase, they didn't have capacity to be supporting refugees. So to get intakes to Dunedin, they needed to have, for instance, sufficient social housing. They needed to have enough staff at, for instance, the local Red Cross to be able to support them. Refugee resettlement usually happens in ethnic groups. So there was a large influx of refugees who came here from both Syria and Afghanistan, and they all, a large chunk of them got resettled in Dunedin. And so now we have quite a thriving Syrian community in particular because of the intakes that happened there. So there were, if I remember correctly, we had about 4 intakes a year. I worked on 2 of the intakes, but my personal capacity wasn't enough for the large amount of support that they needed, unfortunately. I believe that we have or should have capacity to increase our refugee intake. I'm quite concerned that we are going to see more refugees globally on account of climate change, on account of civil and social unrest and wars, and also on account of, we're potentially going to start seeing some rainbow refugees who are coming here because of persecution based on their gender or sexual identity, in particular coming from the United States. So I would really like to see us improve our capacity and work on some solutions that are going to benefit refugees coming here, but are also going to benefit the people who are already here. I don't think that our systems support us sufficiently.
New Zealand have what they describe as a strategic approach to ensuring that anybody migrating to the country can settle in and feel welcome. And they've set themselves some key target indicators that are based around 5 specific outcome areas that they want to focus on: employment, education and training, inclusion, health, well-being, and the English language. The idea of incorporating something like Te Reo Māori or Te Ao Māori within our immigration process, it's not really a big part of that, which can lead to some issues because, as Scout points out, we're a multicultural country that's based on te tiriti, or we should be. And getting those sort of concepts can be really difficult for some people. We've got people who are born and raised in this country who don't understand those concepts, and trying to teach that to migrant communities can be really difficult to do as well. So, Scout has a suggestion on what we can do to fix that up.
The cultural guidance that I have seen, it's a lot of stuff that I think people who grew up here would take for granted. It's things like, you know, how to use an oven. Like there were people who came here, there were refugees who came here and they didn't know how to use an oven, so they would light a fire on the oven door, and that would be how they would cook, which is obviously quite dangerous and it's not designed to be used in that way. Um, it, there's those little things that are quite needed, those little practical things, and they come in the 6-week systems that we do have. But again, those are only systems for refugees. I would like to see more more support to our marae, in particular our urban marae who do a lot of this outreach already, and having these community events. And I think, times like this, where we're coming up to the public holiday of Matariki, the way that we fold Māori culture into our mainstream New Zealand culture has a really big impact on our immigrants as well. Normalizing it and making it mainstream, as opposed to saying, okay, go to this 6-week program at a marae and do some wananga. As opposed to that, it's about making it mainstream, because ultimately we're just causing more separatism if we say, here is a program only for our migrants on New Zealand and Māori culture, when in reality there's probably a lot more quote unquote, hate the phrase, everyday New Zealanders who could do with that kind of support and that understanding of what it is to be in a tiriti-led Aotearoa. I would really like to see it made more accessible and mainstream for people to learn more about Te Tiriti o Waitangi, what it is, and what it means to be living in a Tiriti-led society, because I think that a lot of our division does come from this entire misunderstanding of what Te Tiriti o Waitangi is, what it is to live in a Tiriti-led society, what biculturalism is in an Aotearoa setting, and what co-governance can look like.
It's really easy when talking about immigration to talk about what happens inwardly, what happens to our country, what happens to our communities. What does this mean for us? But immigration has another very different knock on effect in a really positive way. Sam highlights exactly where this starts, and I'll explain shortly what it actually all means.
But surprisingly, a lot of the Filipino people that I know usually send money that they earn here back to their families, which is, it's rather interesting. Um, I mean, I've spoken to quite a few, quite a few at these parties I would attend, and it's just interesting their background. They've moved here to live the life, but they're also sending money back to their families, which, I don't got statistics for, but it is a rather interesting insight into their lives.
What Sam is talking about here is a process called remittance, and it's really, really impactful and something that most people don't really consider when it comes to immigration. Essentially, what it is that migrants who have moved to a new country send part of their paycheck back home, and it has a huge amount of economic power behind it. Not only does the dollar go further because of the way that international currency works, from where the money's come from to where it's going, it goes direct to the communities that need it most. And by the year 2030, the United Nations estimates that it's going to be worth about 8.5 trillion US dollars of currency being pumped into third world countries and lower economic areas that need that help. At the moment, 1 in 9 people globally are affected by this process somehow, either sending or receiving, or the knock on benefit of having that extra currency go into these third world countries. One of the elements of migration that we often forget about is how it's going to affect people outside of the country. But this is a really fascinating cultural way that spans multiple cultures that sees immigration as not only a benefit in terms of skills and experience in this country, but also a financial benefit to the countries that these people have come from. And it's really important for us to remember that migration is not just people moving in, it's how it affects everybody everywhere.
Immigration is always going to be a great place to hide your dog whistles. Like, when certain parties say, oh, we need to get a hand on immigration, what they really mean is we need to get a hand on the brown people coming here, or we need to get a hand on the people who don't worship the same way as us. They're not worried about the people from, the UK or the white South Africans or the Canadians or the Americans. They're not worried about them coming here. They're worried about the other with a capital O.
In February of 1840, there was a rush to get Te Tiriti or Waitangi signed, and one of the reasons for that was because the French were actually planning a colony in Aotearoa, and the British wanted nothing to do with that. But that kicked off a whole bunch of legislation that lasted over 120 years that had a really specific focus of creating what felt like a British ethno-state at the bottom of the South Pacific. There were really targeted laws in place to make sure that the people that were migrating here were the right colour for the government at the time, and we're still seeing the after effects of that. What we're seeing now are people like Julian Batchelor and his anti-co-governance roadshow, highlighting what was promised to migrants for generations, and the last remnants of those generations of migrants and their kids are the ones that tend to be going to these events and listening because that's what they were promised. But that's not what this country is, and it's not what the country is evolving into. Earlier this year, Auckland Council put on an event called World of Cultures, which is designed to celebrate the over 200 different cultures that make Tamaki Makaurau home, that have migrated here over the last few generations. And one of the things I did to research this piece as well, which I found really fascinating, was ask people what they thought was the group of migrants that was the largest coming into the country. And I got a whole range of answers from the English all the way through to the Chinese, and they were all wrong. It's not even Australians. The largest group of people moving into New Zealand over the last 12 months to make it home are New Zealanders. It's repatriated New Zealanders who have New Zealand citizenship, and it far outweighed every other group. But what we're seeing there as well are changes to migratory patterns. England isn't even in the top 5 anymore, but we're seeing a whole bunch of people come from various parts of the world that are bringing in different elements of their culture, as well as enriching our culture in the process by making New Zealand home. And that's what immigration is about. It's about building a new look society. Post-COVID, pre-COVID, it was all about making sure that our country could flourish in the best way possible for everyone. And sometimes that means bringing in skills, bringing in traditions, and bringing in cultures that perhaps the founding fathers, 100 and however many years ago it was, weren't necessarily expecting. That's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. Don't forget you can download previous episodes of the Public Gallery wherever you're getting your podcasts from: Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon. The guy down the street who listens to things far too loudly, although it's much, much harder to download things if somebody else is in control of that kind of stuff. But thank you very much for listening. Don't forget to tune in again next week for another episode of The Public Gallery.